The champagne glasses clinked like fragile wind chimes under the harsh, clinical track lighting of the Chelsea Art Gallery, celebrating Alexandra's latest triumph, while Maximilian watched her from the shadows. She looked absolutely flawless, a vision of contemporary success in a tailored silk dress, until her hand dropped from her wineglass and lingered just a fraction of a second too long against the lower back of her primary investor. It was a microscopic shift in gravity, a silent, damning confession captured only by a husband who already had his bags packed and waiting in the trunk of his car. If stories of quiet departures and the heavy price of betrayal resonate with you, stay with me. There are still many secrets hidden behind these painted canvases. If you want to walk through this gallery of broken trust, don't leave the channel. The Chelsea Gallery smelled of expensive cedarwood perfume, stale champagne, and the sharp metallic tang of ambition. Maximilian Sinclair stood near the coat check, a quiet island of stillness amidst the chaotic tide of Manhattan's cultural elite. His hands were tucked deep into the pockets of his charcoal overcoat, his eyes fixed on the center of the room. There she was, Alexandra Pemberton. She stood beneath a halo of track lighting, flanked by two of her massive, aggressive, abstract canvases. The violent splashes of crimson and obsidian on the linen mirrored the fiery, captivating energy she radiated. She was laughing, tossing her dark hair over her shoulder, her tailored silk dress catching the light with every subtle movement. She was the star, the genius, the darling of the new season, and she belonged to someone else. Maximilian didn't need to look closely to see it. He had spent 10 years mapping every nuance of Alexandra's existence, the way her jaw tightened when she was anxious, the specific cadence of her breath when she lied about being too tired to work. Now he watched as Julian Vance, the gallery's millionaire curator, leaned in to whisper something in her ear. It wasn't a professional distance. It was the leaning of a man who knew the exact temperature of her skin. As Julian pulled back, Alexandra's left hand, the one bearing a platinum band Maximilian had forged himself, dropped from her glass. Her fingers brushed against the small of Julian's back. It was a fleeting, microscopic caress. To the critics and buyers swirling around them, it was nothing. To Maximilian, it was the final, deafening strike of a gavel. He felt no sudden surge of rage. The anger had burned itself out 3 weeks ago, leaving behind a vast, hollow crater in his chest. 3 weeks ago, he had been looking for a reference photo on their shared studio iPad and stumbled upon a hidden album. It wasn't just photos. It was a digital archive of his own obsolescence. Hotel rooms in Miami when she claimed to be at an artist residency. Late-night text threads dissecting how Maximilian was too soft, too stagnant, too comfortable in his obscurity. For 21 days, Maximilian had lived inside a corpse of a marriage. He had poured her coffee, kissed her forehead, and listened to her complain about the stress of the upcoming exhibition, all while the ghost of Julian Vance sat between them at the breakfast table. He had waited for the right moment to scream, to shatter the clay busts in his studio, to demand answers. But as he watched her now, bathing in the adoration of a crowd that valued her persona more than her soul, he realized he didn't want answers. Answers were just another form of negotiation. Across the room, Alexandra caught his eye. For a split second, the polished, confident mask slipped. A flicker of genuine affection, or perhaps just habitual guilt, crossed her face. She raised her glass to him, mouthing the words, "I love you." Maximilian's chest tightened. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply held her gaze for a long, unblinking moment, memorizing the shape of the lie on her lips. Then, he turned around and walked out the glass doors into the freezing November air. The streets of Chelsea were slick with fresh rain. As he walked toward his parked Volvo, the muffled bass of the gallery's sound system faded into the hum of city traffic. His bags were already in the trunk. His passport, his carving knives, and a single box of winter clothes. He took his phone from his pocket, opened his contacts, and swiped to Alexandra's name. With a steady thumb, he pressed block. He didn't leave a note in their Brooklyn loft. He didn't draft a long, agonizing email detailing his heartbreak. He simply got into the driver's seat, turned the key, and merged onto the West Side Highway, leaving his cheating wife to a party she would soon realize was her own funeral. The silence inside the car was absolute, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Maximilian could finally breathe. 3 weeks before the gallery opening, The Brooklyn loft had been perfectly quiet, save for the rhythmic, metallic hum of the ancient radiator. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Alexandra was at a curatorial luncheon in Soho, leaving Maximilian alone in their shared studio space. The air was thick with the familiar, competing sense of turpentine from her side of the room and wet earth from his. He had needed to check an urgent email from a bronze foundry, and his phone lay dead on his workbench. He picked up the shared iPad, the one smudged with dried clay and streaks of cadmium red. He unlocked it with their anniversary date, a passcode she had insisted on years ago, claiming it was romantic. The email application was open, but as his calloused thumb swiped upward to close it, he grazed the Photos application. It opened not to the main gallery, but to a hidden album she had seemingly left unlocked in her rush to catch a cab that morning. Maximilian froze. The screen illuminated his hands in a harsh, clinical blue glow. It was a grid of thumbnails, a meticulously documented double life. There were selfies in upscale hotel bathrooms, places with marble countertops and heavy plush robes that her fledgling sales couldn't yet afford. In them, Julian Vance stood behind her, his hands resting intimately, possessively, on her bare hips. There were timestamps, dates that perfectly corresponded to evenings she claimed she was at the studio working late, nights she had come home sighing, saying she was too exhausted to speak and just needed to sleep. The silence in the loft deepened, pressing heavily against his eardrums. He didn't drop the tablet. He didn't hurl it against the exposed brick wall. His breathing simply grew very shallow. He tapped on a screenshot of a text message thread. He doesn't understand your vision. He's making paperweights while you're building an empire. Alexandra, I know. It's suffocating sometimes. He's so content in his little world. I just need to get through this exhibition. Then we'll figure it out. Miss you. Maximilian slowly sat down on a paint-splattered wooden stool. He stared at the screen until the backlight timed out, leaving him looking at his own distorted reflection in the black glass. The man staring back looked exactly the same as he had 10 minutes ago, yet entirely different. 10 years of shared history, of eating cheap ramen on the floor before they could afford furniture, of holding her while she cried over rejection letters from minor galleries. It was all suddenly rewritten, recontextualized into a pathetic, prolonged joke. When Alexandra returned home that evening, it was raining. She shook her wet umbrella in the hallway, calling out his name with that familiar, melodic lilt. She walked into the studio, smelling of expensive wine and Julian's cologne, a sharp, peppery scent Maximilian had previously assumed was a new artisanal soap she had bought. "Hey you," she said, leaning in to kiss his cheek. Her lips were cold from the wind. The luncheon was exhausting. All these collectors are so pretentious. God, I missed you today. She smiled at him, her dark eyes wide and entirely sincere. That was the most terrifying part. There was no hesitation, no nervous twitch, no avoiding his gaze. She was completely, flawlessly fluid in her deception. Maximilian looked at her, his hands resting on a block of unsculpted clay. He felt a profound, freezing detachment wash over him, numbing the edges of his vision. A lesser man might have confronted her right then. A different man might have demanded tears, begged for an explanation, or shattered the fragile equilibrium of their home with raw, screaming fury. But Maximilian was a sculptor. He understood the structural integrity of things. He knew that once a foundation was fundamentally cracked, no amount of frantic patching could save the structure from eventual collapse. "I made dinner," he replied evenly, his voice devoid of any tremor. "It's in the oven." For the next 21 days, he lived with a ghost. He slept next to a woman he no longer knew, watching her perform the role of a devoted wife with the same detached, clinical precision with which she applied gesso to a canvas. He observed her micro-expressions, the subtle way she guarded her phone, the slight, defensive shifts in her schedule. And in the absolute quiet of his mind, stone by stone, he began to build his exit. The text message arrived at exactly 9 a.m. on Saturday. "The Hudson Valley is beautiful, but the networking is exhausting. All these collectors talk in circles, missing our quiet mornings. Back tomorrow night. Love you." Maximilian stared at the screen of his phone, the glowing text stark against the dim morning light filtering through the industrial windows of their Brooklyn loft. He knew Julian Vance owned a private cabin in the Hudson Valley. He knew exactly what kind of networking was happening there. He didn't reply. Instead, He set the phone down on the concrete kitchen island and walked into the bedroom to pull a single, heavy canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. He packed with the sterile, emotionless efficiency of a surgeon. There was no hesitation, no lingering over sentimental items. He packed 5 heavy wool sweaters, dark denim, sturdy boots, and plain t-shirts. He left the tailored suits Alexandra had bought him for gallery openings. He left the expensive cologne she liked. He left the vintage film camera they had found together at a flea market in Paris. In the studio, he was equally ruthless. He unrolled a leather casing and carefully slotted his Japanese steel carving knives, his favorite calipers, and a few specialized rasps into their pockets. He left behind the massive, heavy armatures, the imported clay, the plaster molds of half-finished concepts. They belonged to a man who no longer existed. When his physical packing was complete, he returned to the kitchen island for the most crucial part of his departure, the digital erasure. He opened his laptop. He systematically logged into his artist portfolio website and deleted the server files, leaving only a blank white domain. He opened Instagram, navigating the labyrinth of settings until he found the option to permanently delete his account, erasing thousands of followers and a decade of documented history in a single keystroke. He did the same for Facebook and LinkedIn. He factory reset the shared studio iPad, watching the screen turn black, taking the hidden iCloud album and the agonizing proof of his broken marriage with it. Finally, he picked up his phone. He opened the back casing, popped out the SIM card, and snapped the tiny piece of plastic in half with his thumbnail, dropping the pieces into the trash. He was no longer a signal on a grid. He was untraceable. The loft was utterly silent. The rhythmic hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the massive, dusty space. Maximilian walked over to Alexandra's side of the studio. It smelled sharply of linseed oil and turpentine. On her heavy wooden easel rested a half-finished canvas, a chaotic, aggressive explosion of manic reds and deep, jagged blacks. It was loud, demanding, and entirely devoid of structure. He looked down at his left hand. Slowly, he gripped the platinum band and slid it over his knuckle. It left behind a pale, indented circle of skin, a physical ghost of a decade-long promise. He did not write a note. He did not ask for a divorce, nor did he curse her name. He simply reached out and placed the heavy platinum ring on the wooden ledge of the easel, right next to a crumpled tube of her favorite crimson paint. The metal clinked faintly against the wood. It sat there, a perfect, unbroken circle resting quietly against the backdrop of her painted chaos. It was a period at the end of a 10-year sentence. Maximilian picked up his duffel bag, slung it over his shoulder, and walked to the front door. He set his house keys on the entry console. He stepped out into the hallway and let the heavy, steel-reinforced door click shut behind him. An hour later, the dark gray Volvo merged onto the George Washington Bridge. The sky above the Hudson River was a bruised, heavy gray, threatening snow. Maximilian kept his hands steady on the steering wheel, driving west, away from the skyline, away from the art world, and away from the woman who was currently whispering his name in another man's bed. He drove into the expanding horizon, carrying nothing but his tools and the cold, breathless weight of absolute freedom. The black town car dropped Alexandra off at the curb of their Brooklyn apartment building at 8 on Sunday evening. The Hudson Valley retreat had been exactly as Julian promised, opulent, influential, and physically exhausting. She carried her leather overnight bag up the stairs, mentally preparing a casual, affectionate lie for Maximilian. She imagined him at his workbench, covered in gray ceramic dust, looking up with that soft, predictable devotion she both relied on and secretly despised. She unlocked the heavy steel door. "Max?" she called out, dropping her keys into the ceramic bowl on the entry console. The sound echoed too sharply against the exposed brick. The loft was immaculate, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the industrial windows. It was cold. The radiators had been turned down. She walked toward the kitchen, noticing the pristine, wiped-down concrete counters. Usually, there would be a half-empty mug, a stray sketchpad, or some sign of a Sunday afternoon spent lingering. There was nothing. A flicker of annoyance flared in her chest. "He's pouting," she thought, pouring herself a glass of mineral water. "He saw me talking to Julian at the gallery, and now he's throwing a silent tantrum." It wasn't until she walked into the studio half of the loft that the chill truly seeped into her bones. His side of the room, usually a chaotic terrain of wire armatures, clay blocks, and specialized rasps, was stripped bare. The heavy leather roll where he kept his Japanese carving knives was gone. The canvas duffel bag from the top closet shelf was missing. Then, she saw her easel, resting on the wooden ledge, perfectly centered next to a crumpled tube of crimson paint, was his platinum wedding band. Alexandra stopped breathing. She approached the easel slowly, as if the ring were a live explosive. She picked it up. It was cold, heavy, and undeniably final. A sudden, violent tremor ran through her hand. She pulled out her phone and dialed his number. It went straight to a generic, automated voicemail. "The number you have reached is no longer in service." She dialed again. Same flat, robotic voice. She opened Instagram to see if he had posted a passive-aggressive departure message, but his profile simply read, "User not found." She checked her email, her messages, even the shared iCloud account on the studio iPad. Everything was wiped clean. Factory reset. He hadn't smashed her canvases. He hadn't screamed at her, calling her the names she knew she deserved. He hadn't demanded an explanation about Julian, or the hotel rooms, or the late-night text messages. He had simply erased himself from her existence with terrifying precision. By Wednesday, the silence in the loft had become deafening. Her massive solo exhibition was a soaring commercial success. Julian had secured 3 new buyers from the retreat, and the art blogs were calling her the defining voice of the new abstract movement. Yet, as she sat in Julian's sleek, minimalist Upper East Side apartment, sipping a vintage Bordeaux, the wine tasted like ash. "You're completely distracted, Alex," Julian noted, reaching across the velvet sofa to trace her collarbone. "We should be celebrating. The Met curator wants a studio visit next month." "Max is gone," she whispered, staring blankly at the Manhattan skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian sighed, withdrawing his hand slightly. "We knew this would happen eventually. He couldn't handle your trajectory. It's for the best. No messy divorce lawyers yet, no dramatic scenes. He did you a massive favor." "You don't understand," Alexandra snapped, her voice cracking, the polished, confident facade finally breaking. "He didn't leave a note. He changed his number. He deleted his entire digital life. It's like he died." She needed his anger. She needed him to fight for her, or at least fight against her, so she could justify her betrayal. She had prepared for a war, armed with arguments about his lack of ambition and her need for creative growth. But Maximilian had refused to play his part. By leaving in absolute silence, he had denied her the narrative of the misunderstood, stifled artist breaking free. Instead, he had left her alone in a spotless, empty room with nothing but the suffocating, inescapable truth of her own guilt. The rain in the Pacific Northwest did not fall. It settled. It was a pervasive, heavy mist that soaked through wool and seeped into the marrow of the bones. Maximilian stood in the center of the dilapidated barn he had rented with cash, on the outskirts of Astoria, Oregon, listening to the relentless drumming of water against the corrugated tin roof. The air smelled of wet cedar, decaying pine needles, and old motor oil. It was a universe away from the curated cedarwood perfumes of Chelsea galleries and the sharp tang of linseed oil in his former Brooklyn loft. Here, there was no audience. There were no critics. There was only the vast, green indifference of the ancient forest. He had driven for 5 days, sleeping in cheap motels off the interstate, his mind a blank, humming static. The adrenaline that had fueled his precise departure had finally evaporated somewhere in the mountains of Idaho, leaving behind a crushing, paralyzing exhaustion. Now, looking at the meager pile of his belongings on the swept dirt floor, a canvas duffel bag, a box of winter clothes, and the heavy leather roll of his carving tools, the sheer scale of what he had done finally hit him. He hadn't just left a cheating wife. He had amputated a decade of his own existence. Maximilian walked over to a scarred, heavy wooden workbench left behind by a previous tenant. He unrolled the leather casing. The Japanese steel knives and specialized rasps gleamed faintly in the gray light filtering through a dirty window pane. These were the hands that had built Alexandra's canvas stretchers, the hands that had rubbed her shoulders when she was stressed, the hands she had ultimately found too comfortable, too stagnant. He reached out to touch the smooth wooden handle of his favorite chisel. His fingers trembled slightly. As soon as his skin made contact with the wood, a sudden, violent wave of nausea washed over him. The physical memory of his old life, of standing next to her easel, sharing a quiet morning coffee before the studio filled with light, was too closely tied to the tools of his trade. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He couldn't do it. For the first 3 weeks in Astoria, Maximilian existed as a phantom. He bought his groceries at a small, independent hardware and supply store in town, exchanging only polite, monosyllabic nods with the locals who eyed the stranger in the dark wool coat. He ate canned soup cold. He drank bitter black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. He slept on a cheap mattress on the floor of the barn, wrapped in heavy sleeping bags, listening to the wind tear through the towering Douglas firs. The silence he had imposed on Alexandra was now his own prison. He had no phone to check, no emails to answer, no social media to scroll through. He was forced to sit in the absolute quiet and face the ruined foundation of his ego. Every attempt to create ended in failure. One afternoon, he dragged a massive, waterlogged piece of driftwood into the barn, intending to carve. He stared at it for hours, his mind entirely blank. The wood felt dead. The inspiration that used to flow through him like a quiet river had dried up, replaced by the toxic, agonizing images of Alexandra's hidden iCloud album. He saw Julian's hands on her hips in the grain of the wood. He heard her deceptive, melodic laughter in the rattling of the drafty windows. He realized, with a profound, terrifying sorrow, that his art had always been a silent dialogue with her. Even when she dismissed his work as secondary, he had been sculpting with the subconscious hope of grounding her, of proving his quiet worth. Without her, the conversation was over. The clay was just dirt. The wood was just rot. Maximilian sat down on a wooden crate, buried his face in his rough, calloused hands, and for the first time since the night of the gallery opening, he let the tears come. He wept silently, his shoulders shaking in the freezing damp air of the barn, mourning the death of the man he used to be. Winter hit Manhattan with a brutal, unforgiving elegance. From the vantage point of Julian's 52nd floor penthouse on Billionaire's Row, Central Park looked like a jagged white fracture running through the heart of the city. Alexandra stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, pressing her forehead against the freezing pane. In her right hand, a heavy crystal tumbler held her third gin and tonic of the afternoon. On the marble kitchen island behind her lay the Sunday edition of the Times. Her face, beautiful, aloof, strategically shadowed, graced the cover of the arts section. The headline heralded her as the uncompromising visionary of modern abstraction. Her recent solo exhibition had sold out in 48 hours, grossing just under $2 million. She had everything she had ever told Maximilian she wanted, and she was suffocating. "You're drinking gin before 3, Julian's voice drifted from the expansive living area. He didn't look up from his iPad. He was dressed in a pristine cashmere sweater, his legs crossed, the very picture of curated leisure. "We have the MoMA board dinner at 8. You need to be sharp, Alex. The trustees want the visionary, not a tragic cliché." Alexandra turned slowly, the ice clinking against the glass. The sound was sharp, grating in the vast, minimalist quiet of the apartment. She looked at the man she had traded her marriage for. When she was with Maximilian, Julian had represented a thrilling escape, a doorway into a world of power, influence, and unapologetic ambition. Now, trapped on the inside, she realized Julian didn't love her. He loved his investment. He loved the narrative of the brilliant, fiery artist he had discovered and tamed. The moment her edges began to fray, his affection cooled into clinical management. "I'm fine, Julian," she said, her voice thin, lacking its usual magnetic resonance. "Just unwinding." "You haven't painted in a month," he noted coldly, swiping to a new screen. "The gallery needs new inventory by spring. You can't ride the wave of this last show forever. Whatever this phase is, you need to compartmentalize it." Compartmentalize it. She took a long, burning swallow of the gin. How could she compartmentalize a void? Maximilian's silence wasn't just an absence. It was an active, breathing entity in the room with her. It followed her to gallery openings, whispering in her ear when she smiled for the cameras. It sat beside her in Julian's bed, heavy and judgmental. If he had screamed, she could have labeled him abusive. If he had begged, she could have pitied him. If he had demanded half her assets, she could have fought him with lawyers. But by vanishing completely, by leaving the platinum ring perfectly placed next to her paint tubes, he had executed a flawless psychological checkmate. He had made her the undeniable villain of a story that no one else was reading. She set the empty tumbler on a side table and walked into the guest bedroom she had claimed as a makeshift office. She closed the heavy oak door and locked it. The quiet click brought a fleeting sense of security. Sitting at the sleek glass desk, Alexandra opened her laptop. Her hands were shaking. She bypassed her crowded inbox, ignoring the congratulations from sycophantic curators and minor celebrities. Instead, she opened a secure, encrypted browser window. She had spent the last 3 nights meticulously researching. Now she pulled up an email draft addressed to a boutique private intelligence firm based in Lower Manhattan, former federal agents who specialized in locating people who did not want to be found. Target name, Maximilian Sinclair. Age, 34. Last known location, Brooklyn, NY. Left approximately 6 weeks ago. Vehicle, 2018 Volvo XC60. Dark gray. No digital footprint. No active bank accounts. Objective, locate current residence. Discretion is absolute. She stared at the cursor blinking against the stark white background. A part of her knew how pathetic this was. The triumphant, independent artist paying thousands of dollars to track down the husband she had betrayed. But the alternative, living the rest of her life shadowboxing with a ghost, never knowing if he was dead in a ditch or simply indifferent to her existence, was driving her clinically insane. She needed to see his face. She needed to look into his eyes and force him to acknowledge the damage they had done to each other. She needed her dramatic ending. Alexandra swallowed hard, fighting the tightening in her throat, and clicked send. The frost had set deep into the timber of the barn, turning the Oregon air sharp and crystalline. For 8 weeks, Maximilian had existed in a state of suspended animation, moving only through the necessary motions of survival, chopping firewood, brewing bitter coffee, watching the heavy gray clouds roll relentlessly over the Columbia River. His hands, once constantly in motion, had remained aggressively still, stuffed deep into the pockets of his dark wool coat. Until a Tuesday morning in late January, he had gone to the local lumber yard on the edge of town to buy a cord of firewood. The air inside the massive, open-air warehouse was thick with the scent of freshly milled cedar and damp earth. As he was loading rough-hewn logs into the back of his rusted rental truck, he paused. His eyes caught a massive, discarded burl of black walnut sitting near the scrap pile. It was ugly, scarred by disease and harsh weather, a chaotic, twisted knot of hardened grain. "It's a stubborn piece," a voice said over the low whine of a distant bandsaw. Maximilian turned. A woman in her late 30s, wearing a faded canvas work jacket and a respirator pulled down around her neck, was leaning against a stack of plywood. Her hands were covered in fine sawdust. This was Nora. He had seen her a few times at the hardware store, always buying specialized sanding belts or brass fittings, but they had never spoken. "Most people want the clean cuts," Nora continued, walking over and resting a calloused, ungloved hand on the scarred wood. "They want straight lines. They don't know what to do with the trauma in the grain. It fights back." Maximilian looked at the wood, then up at her. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to anyone in 2 months. His voice, when he finally used it, was gravelly, rusted from disuse. "How much for it?" Nora studied his face. She didn't ask what he intended to make. She didn't offer a polite smile, attempt small talk, or pry into why a man with New York tailored coats was buying scrap wood in the freezing rain. She simply read the hollow exhaustion in his eyes and nodded. "Take it. It's been sitting there for months, waiting for someone angry enough to carve it." That afternoon, back in the freezing solitude of the barn, Maximilian unrolled his leather tool casing. The Japanese steel carving knives caught the pale, watery winter light. He didn't sketch. He didn't draft a maquette. For the first time in his professional life, he didn't think about how the piece would complement a painting or how it would fit into the curated, sterile space of a Chelsea gallery. He picked up a heavy wooden mallet and his widest, sharpest chisel. He placed the steel edge against the jagged knot of the black walnut burl. He struck. The sound cracked through the silent barn like a gunshot. A thick, splintered shard of wood flew across the dirt floor. Maximilian struck again, harder this time. The physical exertion tore through the icy numbness that had encased him for weeks. He carved with a violent, unedited rhythm, channeling the agonizing, vivid images of the hidden iCloud album, the suffocating, peppery scent of Julian's cologne in his home, the cold, heavy weight of the platinum ring he had left on the easel. Hours bled into the pitch black of night. His knuckles bled, scraped by the rough bark, but he didn't stop. He was stripping away the rot, digging furiously into the diseased core of the wood. The form that began to emerge beneath his brutal strikes wasn't the smooth, harmonious, passive shapes Alexandra had always praised and utilized as mere background for her own art. It was jagged, visceral, and terrifyingly honest. It looked like a ribcage violently tearing itself open from the inside. When he finally dropped the mallet, his chest was heaving, his breath pluming in the freezing air. His arms trembled from exhaustion. He stood back and looked at what he had done under the harsh glare of a single utility light. It was raw. It was ugly. It was magnificent. For the first time since he walked out of the gallery in New York, Maximilian Sinclair felt a faint, steady heartbeat return to his chest. He was no longer just a ghost, haunting the edges of his own ruined life. He was bleeding, he was breathing, and he was finally fighting back. The encrypted email arrived in Alexandra's inbox at precisely 2:15 p.m. on a bleak Thursday. She was sitting at the glass desk in Julian's guest bedroom, staring blankly at a pristine, untouched stretch of Belgian linen. The subject line was a sterile string of alphanumeric characters. Her heart executed a violent, heavy thud against her ribs. She clicked the link, her fingers trembling over the trackpad, and entered the passcode the intelligence firm had provided. A PDF document materialized on the screen, titled simply Subject M, Sinclair, Locate and Observe. She didn't know what she expected to find. A part of her, the dark, narcissistic core that had fueled her ambition for the past 3 years, had anticipated a tragedy. She had subconsciously wanted to see him broken, living in a squalid motel, drowning his sorrows in cheap whiskey, utterly paralyzed by the loss of her. She wanted the visual proof that she had ruined him, because ruin implied significance. Ruin meant she still mattered. She scrolled down to the first photograph. It was taken from a distance, slightly grainy, framed by the blurred branches of a pine tree. The location tag read, Astoria, Oregon. There he was, Maximilian. He was walking out of a small, rustic hardware store, carrying a brown paper bag. He wasn't wearing the tailored charcoal overcoat she had bought him for their anniversary. He wore a faded, heavy canvas work jacket and dark denim. His hair was longer, pushed back carelessly from his forehead. Even through the digital noise of the zoomed-in lens, she could see a fundamental shift in his posture. The quiet, anxious tension that used to sit in his shoulders when he navigated her gallery openings was gone. He looked exhausted, perhaps, but entirely solid. He looked like a man standing on his own 2 feet, deeply anchored to the wet earth beneath him. Alexandra swallowed dryly and scrolled to the next image. It was a dilapidated, corrugated steel barn, set against a backdrop of towering, misty Douglas firs. The notes beneath the photo indicated this was his current residence and workspace. It was a brutal, isolated environment. There was no heating visible, no modern amenities, no espresso machines or curated lighting. It was a place of extreme austerity. Yet, parked outside was his dark gray Volvo. It was real. He was actually there, breathing the freezing, rain-soaked air of the Pacific Northwest, existing in a timeline that had absolutely nothing to do with her. Then, she reached the final series of photos. Maximilian was at a lumber yard, standing near a pile of rough scrap wood. He wasn't alone. He was talking to a woman in a work jacket, her hands covered in sawdust. The private investigator's notes identified her simply as a local woodworker. The photos captured a sequence of their interaction. Maximilian wasn't smiling, but in the third frame, he was looking at the woman with a quiet, respectful attention. His posture was relaxed. He was engaging with the world again. A sharp, physical pain bloomed in Alexandra's chest, so acute it forced a gasp from her throat. It wasn't jealousy. It was something far more devastating. Irrelevance. He wasn't plotting a revenge. He wasn't crafting a dramatic return to New York to fight for her honor. He had simply walked out of the frame of her life and continued to exist. The 10 years they had spent together, the marriage vows, the shared studio, the devastating betrayal. It hadn't killed him. It had just made him leave. She stared at the image of his calloused hands, resting on a piece of rough timber. Those hands had built her life, and now they were building a new one, thousands of miles away, completely devoid of her influence. The door to the office clicked open. Julian walked in, holding his phone, looking impeccably groomed and entirely disconnected from her internal apocalypse. "The gallery just called," he said smoothly. "They need the concept sketches for the spring collection by Monday. You haven't sent anything, Alex." Alexandra slowly closed the laptop, the screen going black, cutting off the image of the damp Oregon forest. She looked at Julian, seeing the transactional impatience in his eyes, the sterile, calculated perfection of the life she had chosen. She was sitting in a 52-story glass cage, entirely paralyzed, while the man she had discarded was out in the rain, finally breathing free. The rental car's tires spun violently in the thick, freezing mud before finally catching traction. Alexandra threw the vehicle into park, her breath fogging the windshield. Through the heavy, relentless Oregon downpour, the corrugated steel structure looked less like a barn and more like a rusted, forgotten monument at the edge of the world. She stepped out, immediately sinking an inch into the wet earth. Her pristine, camel hair Max Mara coat and Italian leather boots, a uniform built for the paved, predictable grids of Manhattan, were instantly ruined. She didn't care. She slammed the car door, the sound swallowed by the vast, roaring canopy of the Douglas firs, and marched toward the heavy wooden door of the barn. She didn't knock. She grabbed the rusted iron latch and pushed it open. The air inside was freezing, smelling sharply of wet earth, raw timber, and old sawdust. A single, high-wattage utility light cast harsh, dramatic shadows across the dirt floor. In the center of the room, standing over a massive, scarred block of black walnut, was Maximilian. At the sound of the door crashing against the interior wall, he stopped. He was holding a heavy wooden mallet in one hand and a broad chisel in the other. He wore a faded flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled up past the elbows, revealing forearms dusted with pale wood shavings. He didn't jump. He didn't drop his tools. He simply turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers through the dusty, freezing air. For 10 seconds, the only sound was the rain drumming furiously against the tin roof. "You coward," Alexandra said. Her voice, usually so melodic and commanding, cracked on the second syllable. She stepped further into the barn, her hands balled into tight fists inside her coat pockets. 10 years, a decade of my life, Max, and you leave a ring on an easel and just vanish? Like I was nothing? Like we were nothing? She wanted him to scream. She had spent a grueling 6-hour flight from JFK preparing for a war. She had rehearsed her defense, her apologies, her tears, and her righteous anger at his passive-aggressive abandonment. She needed him to hurl a chisel at the wall, to call her a whore, to demand to know about Julian. Maximilian looked at her. He didn't move toward her. He slowly set his mallet down on the workbench, the wood making a soft, deliberate thud. He placed the chisel next to it. Then, he picked up a clean rag and began to wipe the sawdust from his hands. "You shouldn't have come here, Alexandra," he said. His voice was quiet, incredibly calm, and utterly devoid of the emotional static she had crossed a continent to find. It wasn't the voice of a heartbroken husband. It was the voice of a man speaking to a stranger who had walked into the wrong room. "I shouldn't have come," she laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound that echoed off the rusted steel walls. "You changed your number. You wiped your accounts. You made me think you might be dead in a ditch somewhere. Do you have any idea what the last 2 months have been like for me?" "I imagine they have been very successful," he replied smoothly, finally looking up from his hands. "The solo exhibition sold well, I assume. Julian must be pleased." The mention of Julian's name, spoken with such casual, clinical detachment, was a physical blow. She flinched, the remaining color draining from her face. "You knew, and instead of fighting for me, instead of fighting for us, you just ran away." "I didn't run," Maximilian said, taking a slow step backward, leaning against his workbench. He crossed his arms over his chest, putting an invisible, impenetrable wall of cold Oregon air between them. "I looked at the foundation of our life, and I saw that it was completely rotten. There was nothing left to fight for. I just refused to participate in the performance anymore." "You don't get to do this," she screamed, taking a desperate step forward, the mud squelching beneath her ruined boots. "You don't get to take the moral high ground and pretend you're above it all." You owe me a conversation. You owe me an ending. The ending was on the easel, Maximilian said softly. He looked at her not with rage, nor with the lingering, pathetic devotion she had hoped to exploit. He looked at her with a profound, quiet pity. I have nothing left to give you, Alex. Not my anger, and certainly not my forgiveness. Please go back to New York. He turned his back to her, picked up his mallet and chisel, and placed the steel edge against the wood. He struck it, the loud crack shattering the air, deliberately drowning out the sound of her jagged, desperate sobbing. The rhythmic crack of the mallet against the chisel was deafening in the enclosed space. Each strike sent a shower of pale shavings onto the dirt floor, entirely ignoring the woman shivering in the center of the room. Alexandra stood frozen, the harsh utility light casting long, distorted shadows around her. She wiped her face with the back of her ruined sleeve, her chest heaving, the adrenaline of her screaming fading into a cold, hollow panic. Since he wouldn't look at her, she finally looked around. Beyond the workbench, arranged in the dimmer periphery of the barn, stood a series of completed and half-finished sculptures. Alexandra walked toward them slowly, her breath catching in her throat, the mud squelching faintly beneath her boots. For a decade, Maximilian had sculpted with a quiet, polite deference. His old work had been smooth, harmonious, designed to complement her chaotic canvases rather than challenge them. The pieces standing before her now were entirely alien. They were carved from dark, scarred burls of walnut and jagged pillars of reclaimed cedar. One piece, standing nearly 6 feet tall, looked like a thoracic cavity that had been violently wrenched open, the grain of the wood twisting in an agonizing, beautiful spiral of tension and release. Another depicted 2 distinct masses tearing away from each other, connected only by impossibly thin, fragile splinters of wood that seemed ready to snap under the weight of the damp air itself. They were not polite. They were feral. They were a visceral, 3-dimensional language of betrayal, grief, and a terrifying, unapologetic liberation. Alexandra was an artist before she was a wife, and she knew a masterpiece when she saw one. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Julian would have killed to feature this collection. Critics in New York would have written endless, fawning essays about the raw vulnerability of the work. But these sculptures didn't belong to New York. They didn't belong to her. They were born from the pain she had inflicted, yet they excluded her entirely. He had not just survived the destruction of their marriage, he had used the wreckage to build something monumental. Her knees gave out. Alexandra collapsed onto the cold, sawdust-covered floor, her expensive Max Mara coat soaking up the damp earth. The performative anger that had carried her across the country dissolved, leaving behind a pathetic, suffocating despair. She began to weep, not the beautiful, tragic tears she had practiced in the airplane bathroom, but messy, ugly, jagged sobs. She curled inward, clutching her chest as if trying to hold her fracturing ego together. The sound of the mallet stopped. The sudden silence in the barn was heavier than the noise. She heard the soft crunch of his boots on the dirt. He stopped a few feet away from her. She didn't look up, expecting him to finally shout, to demand she leave, to show some crack of the rage she so desperately needed him to feel. Instead, a clean, white cotton rag fell gently onto the dirt beside her hand. She raised her head, her face streaked with mascara and tears. Maximilian stood above her. There was no hatred in his dark eyes, nor was there the slightest glimmer of the subservient love she had exploited for a decade. He looked at her the way one might look at a bird that had flown into a window pane, with a detached, absolute pity. "It's a long drive back to Portland, Alex," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm, steady rhythm of the rain outside. "You should start before the roads freeze." He didn't offer his hand to help her up. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply turned around, walked back to the block of black walnut, and picked up his tools, leaving her entirely alone in the shadow of his genius. The descent into JFK Airport was turbulent, mirroring the violent, unspooling anxiety in Alexandra's chest. She had spent the entire 6-hour flight staring out the tiny acrylic window at the endless expanse of clouds. Her reflection ghosted against the glass. The woman looking back at her was unrecognizable, haggard, stripped of her curated glamour, her expensive coat still bearing the faint, dry stains of Oregon mud. By the time the yellow cab dropped her off on Billionaire's Row, the Manhattan skyline felt less like a conquest and more like a towering, glass-paned cemetery. She took the private elevator up to the 52nd floor. The doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime. The penthouse was immaculate, bathed in the artificial warmth of recessed lighting. Julian was sitting at the marble kitchen island, dressed in a crisp Tom Ford dress shirt, aggressively typing on his laptop with a lukewarm espresso by his side. He didn't look up when she dropped her leather bag on the hardwood floor. "You missed the MoMA board dinner," Julian said, his voice perfectly modulated, but laced with a lethal, professional irritation. "I had to tell them you were dealing with a sudden family emergency, which, considering you have no family I'm aware of, made me look entirely incompetent." "Where have you been, Alex?" Alexandra stared at the back of his perfectly groomed head. She remembered the hidden iCloud photos, the hotel rooms, the thrilling, intoxicating rush of sneaking around behind Maximilian's back. She had burned a 10-year marriage to the ground for this man. She had traded a husband who built her canvas stretchers with his bare hands for a curator who managed her like a volatile stock portfolio. "I went to see Max," she said, her voice completely hollow. Julian finally stopped typing. He closed the laptop slowly and turned around, his expression tightening into a mask of pure disgust. "You went to Oregon. You compromised your mental state and your production schedule to chase down a man who willingly walked away from you. Have you lost your mind?" "I lost my mind 3 years ago," Alexandra whispered, "when I let you convince me that I was too big for my own life." "I made you who you are," Julian snapped, stepping away from the counter, the veneer of the sophisticated lover finally cracking to reveal the ruthless businessman beneath. "You were a struggling indie painter, crying over minor gallery rejections before I gave you a platform. Don't mistake your talent for my influence. You need me." Alexandra looked around the sprawling, cold apartment. There were no traces of her here, not really. No messy paint tubes, no worn sweaters draped over chairs. It was a showroom, and she was just the most expensive piece of art on display. Without another word, she walked into the guest bedroom, grabbed her suitcase, and began throwing her clothes inside. Julian followed her, standing in the doorway, his arms crossed. He delivered threats masked as professional advice, warning her about gallery contracts and frozen assets, but the words sounded like static to her. She zipped the suitcase shut, walked past him into the living room, and placed his spare set of keys on the glass coffee table. The metal clinked against the glass, a harsh, cheap echo of the platinum ring Maximilian had left on her easel. She walked out into the hallway and let the heavy door shut behind her, stepping into the absolute terrifying isolation she had meticulously built for herself. 3,000 miles away, the storm over the Columbia River had finally broken. Pale, watery sunlight filtered through the dirty windows of the Astoria barn, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Maximilian stood before the massive 6-foot sculpture of twisted black walnut. He held a square of fine-grit sandpaper, smoothing the final, jagged edge of the wood where the two forms violently separated. His hands were calloused, scarred, and entirely steady. He stepped back and exhaled. The piece was finished. He waited for the familiar ache in his chest, the phantom weight of his broken marriage, the sharp sting of Julian's shadow, the pity he had felt when Alexandra collapsed on this very floor just days ago. He searched his mind for the anger that had fueled the first brutal strikes of the chisel. It was gone. There was no residual hatred. There was no lingering sorrow. There was only the quiet, breathing presence of the wood and the profound, silent space within himself. The ghost of his past had finally vacated the premises. Maximilian set his tools down on the workbench, walked over to the open barn doors, and breathed in the scent of wet pine, feeling an absolute, staggering lightness in his bones. 2 years later, November rain washed over the cracked pavements of Brooklyn, slick and gray. Alexandra sat on a worn velvet sofa in a cramped, second-floor apartment. It was a drastic downgrade from Julian's Billionaire's Row penthouse, a space she had been forced to rent after severing her toxic ties and watching her gallery representation quietly choose Julian's influence over her erratic, uninspired output. On the scarred wooden coffee table in front of her lay the latest issue of Artforum. The glossy cover did not feature abstract splashes of crimson and obsidian. Instead, it displayed a stark, beautifully lit photograph of a massive, twisted black walnut sculpture. The grain of the wood looked like a rib cage torn open, frozen in a silent, agonizing scream. The headline, printed in bold, minimalist font, read, The Brutal Grace of M. Sinclair, an anonymous masterpiece. Alexandra reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and traced the glossy image. The accompanying article detailed the meteoric, whispered rise of an unrepresented, reclusive sculptor based somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Critics hailed the work as a raw, visceral deconstruction of modern grief and liberation. The pieces had sold for staggering, unprecedented sums through a proxy dealer, yet the artist entirely refused public exhibitions, interviews, or gallery representation. He had achieved the exact pinnacle of critical reverence she had spent a decade desperately chasing, and he had done it without compromising a single fraction of his soul. She closed the magazine, the heavy pages slapping together in the quiet apartment. There was no alcohol left to numb the sharp, persistent ache in her chest. There was no Julian to blame, and no audience to perform for. The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect, agonizing echo of the quiet departure Maximilian had executed 2 years ago. She finally understood that the most devastating consequence of her infidelity was not the loss of her marriage, but the unbearable realization that her betrayal was the catalyst for his greatness, a greatness she was forever locked out of. She was a footnote in the history of the man she had thrown away. 3,000 miles away, the morning mist was just beginning to lift over the Columbia River. Maximilian stepped out onto the heavy cedar deck of the cabin he had built himself, a mile deeper into the woods from the old rusted barn. He wore a thick wool sweater and heavy denim, a steaming ceramic mug of black coffee cradled in his calloused hands. The Oregon air was biting, smelling of damp pine needles, wet earth, and the distant metallic tang of the ocean. Inside the cabin, a fire crackled steadily in the cast-iron stove. On his massive workbench, a new block of reclaimed cedar waited, but there was no frantic urgency to strike the chisel. The violent, agonizing need to carve his trauma into the wood had passed, exercised completely in that first, acclaimed series. Now, he sculpted simply because he loved the weight of the tools, the honest resistance of the grain, and the quiet rhythm of his own breathing. A blue jay landed on the railing of the deck, tilting its head before taking flight into the towering canopy of the Douglas firs. Maximilian watched it go, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't check his phone. He didn't know about the magazine cover in New York, and if he did, it wouldn't have mattered. The noise of the art world, the frantic scrambling for relevance, the ghost of a platinum ring left on an easel, it all felt like a lifetime ago, belonging to a man he barely remembered. He leaned against the wooden railing, feeling the cold wind bite his cheeks. He closed his eyes and listened to the vast, unbroken silence of the forest. There was no anxiety tightening his shoulders, no performance to maintain, no subtle deceptions to decode. There was only the wood, the winter air, and the absolute, staggering clarity of his own mind. Maximilian opened his eyes, taking in the endless expanse of green and gray. He exhaled, his breath pluming in the freezing morning, completely and genuinely happy.